So we left last class talking about reflexes, and for a lot of you this will be familiar. The lab this week has talked a lot about reflexes, and so you know the general components of a reflex arc, which is the circuitry supporting a reflex, right? Reflex arc is the circuitry supporting a reflex. We talked about somatic versus autonomic. Here we have the spinal cord like we are really familiar with. We know the anterior side from the fissure. We can look at the shape of the gray matter. We know the dorsal root ganglia on the posterior roots. Motor, afferent, sensory, efferent. So we have everything set up pretty nicely. Plus it's labeled. Oh no, this one's not labeled. You might have been confused. Maybe. The components of a reflex arc, straightforward and repetitive from what you know in lab. There's some sensory body that detects a signal. It could be a receptor itself or directly the dendrites of a nerve. If it's a receptor itself, the nerve is closely associated with that receptor, and that afferent sensory axon is stimulated, it's excited. It sends a signal back to the central nervous system for processing. And here, this basic reflex arc with one synapse that we call a monosynaptic reflex is processed in the spinal cord. Sensory information goes to an interneuron, which is involved in integrating the information. And a major focus of what we talk about in the next section is, what does integration mean? It's really just the sequence and the combined firing of many interneurons, or upstream and downstream neurons. That's coming up. So the interneuron processes it and creates a synapse or connects to a motor neuron, which carries out whatever the task is to be carried out. That goes to whatever the effector is. Here, this is a somatic reflex because it's innervating skeletal muscle. And we're pretty sure it's skeletal muscle because it looks like muscle and it's striated, which indicates skeletal muscle. It's not smooth. It's not uniform like cardiac muscle or smooth muscle. It's skeletal muscle. It's also not a gland and it's not adipose, so this is a somatic reflex. So this is, in its most basic form, the reflex arc. A sense is transmitted to a motor neuron through some stimulatory interneuron, or a stimulatory potential. It activates a motor neuron. And a great example of that you saw in lab was the stretch reflex. And if you haven't been to lab yet, you've had this done in your infancy at the doctor's. They sat you on the table, they hit your knee with a hammer, and your lower leg jumped. The stretch reflex. This is one of four main types of reflex that we're going to look at today and that are in the book. Yeah, I'll just leave that. We'll get there. The other names of the reflexes coming up. So this one is also monosynaptic, technically. I'd probably argue that there's more than one synapse. If that's the case, it's called polysynaptic. But technically it's monosynaptic for now. And it's what we call ipsilateral. Ipsilateral, meaning the sensory information and the motor output occur on the same side of the body, same side of the spinal cord. Ipsilateral and monosynaptic. So we have some sensory information from the stretch reflex, and you all felt what that was without defining that sensory information. That sensory information is generated by the muscle spindle, which is at the leftmost of this graph, the little football-shaped thing with the blue nerve endings wrapped around it, muscle spindle. And this directly determines the length of a muscle, and importantly, the rate of change of the length of that muscle. How quickly is it lengthening or shortening? But in the case of the stretch reflex, it's how quickly is it lengthening. The muscle spindle is activated when it extends or lengthens very quickly. These are usually in line with the fibers. They're not part of the contraction apparatus, but they're interspersed throughout, and can tell the brain, or the spinal cord in this case, how quickly the muscle is elongating. So if it's elongating quickly and we activate the spindle, that sense goes back to the interneurons in the spinal cord, which creates a synapse through an interneuron, or here directly to a motor neuron, to activate contraction. To activate contraction. The effector, the efferent signal, goes to the target muscle that was stretched. And there's a couple terms here that we'll see increasingly in the coming lectures. It turns on the muscle, it contracts the muscle when the motor neuron synapses connects to the skeletal muscle, what we call the neuromuscular junction. And you'd think it was direct, and it's pretty close to direct, but it's not exactly direct. We need a signal to go from the nerve to the muscle, and that signal is a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. Neurotransmitters are the class of molecule, and acetylcholine is one of the types of neurotransmitter. This is the single synapse of the monosynaptic reflex, the sense to a motor neuron which activates contraction in the muscle. That's your leg jumping. Why does it do this? If you think about it, fast stretch is not good for muscles, for tendons, for joints. Abrupt, fast stretch could mean rupture, could mean damage. And so as a protective mechanism, the body activates the muscle to slow the stretch or prevent the stretch. And so when you hit the patellar tendon with the hammer, you only provided a transient stretch. The muscle didn't continue to elongate, but it was quick and abrupt enough that it activated this reflex to protect the knee, to protect the knee extensors from damage. Now, I'd argue that this is polysynaptic, because there's also this gray area in the spinal cord, which we haven't talked about yet, that is involved in the stretch reflex. Another synapse occurs. So technically it's more than one, polysynaptic. And this is an important part of any type of contraction. Reciprocal innervation is what this is called. Reciprocal innervation. This ensures that when a muscle contracts, it's not opposed. Reciprocal innervation. So the same sensory neuron that activated the quadriceps, or the knee extensors in this case, also sends a signal to the knee flexors, or the hamstrings. That signal is don't contract. What would happen if both contracted at once? Quadriceps and hamstrings contract at once. You're all right, nothing happens. Way to not answer. I heard one down here. Nothing happens. If they both contract at once, there's no movement of the lower limb. And so we need to inactivate or inhibit the antagonist muscles, in this case the knee flexors. And so we see that under the gray or black circle. The sensory neuron activates what's called an inhibitory interneuron. This will be the subject of extensive discussion in the next series of slides, so not to worry if you don't get it now. But the point is, this neuron hyperpolarizes, prevents signals from being sent through the motor neuron to the antagonist muscle. Turns it off. Anytime you contract a muscle, this happens to the opposing muscle. It has to, or you wouldn't have movement. You don't turn on or you inactivate the antagonist muscle. So pretty straightforward. And this is closely related to the tendon reflex. Very similar overall picture. reflex, reaction to the tendon reflex. Tendon reflex is a major reason why when you stretch, that the stretch deepens. It also might be part of the mechanism that if you're at the gym lifting a really heavy weight, that the muscles seem to fade really quickly if you're lifting a really heavy weight, if you're really fatigued. The tendon reflex helps with those responses. When I say helps, not necessarily from a gains point of view, but from a function and protection point of view. So the tendon reflex is a feedback mechanism to prevent excess tension in the muscle. Not length, tension. Tension's bad because you're pulling the muscle apart. When there's tension, you're pulling both ends apart, and if there's too much tension, the muscle belly might rupture, the tendon might separate from the muscle, the tendon might separate from the bone. Too much tension is bad. So we have a receptor again, we have an integration center, and we have an effector. Similarly to the stretch reflex, but not similarly. The receptor monitors the tension in the tendon specifically. They're called Golgi tendon organs. They're shaped somewhat similarly to spindles, but they're not located in the muscle. They're located in the tendon specifically, and monitors the tension on the tendon. If it becomes too high, the Golgi tendon organs activate the sensory afferent. What happens when we activate the sensory afferent? Well, the synapse in the spinal cord is primarily to inhibit that muscle. If there's tension in a muscle, I don't want to turn it on anymore. That will only increase the tension. So let's turn it off. Let's protect that muscle and tendon and bone from damage. So we inhibit that muscle, the agonist, the muscle that is being stretched. That is the subject of our discussion currently. We also, at the same time, activate the opposing or antagonist muscle to allow movement in the direction of that antagonist muscle. So polysynaptic, technically reflex. We inhibit the quadriceps, we activate the hamstrings, which allows flexion of the knee. And in general, like with any receptor, the more tension there is, the larger the signal. The larger the signal, the more inhibition and the more movement of the leg. Overall, the idea is there's no movement of the leg if there's opposing muscles to activate it, so a lot like reciprocal innervation. We turn one off while we turn the other on, and the tendon reflex will deactivate the agonist or the muscle under tension, the subject, to prevent it from injury and reduce tension. Now these are relatively simple reflexes. They are involved with neurons at the spinal cord at one level or in one segment. There's usually one afferent, one efferent, or at least from one area to one effector. They get more complicated though. But knowing what we know about the simple reflexes, if we break this down, it's really not too difficult to comprehend or understand. This one and the next one, the flexor withdrawal and the crossed-extensor reflex, often happen in tandem. But we'll talk about this one first. This withdrawal reflex is in response to pain, so walking around and you stub your toe on your coffee table, or you step on a tack, as in this example. Painful. You withdraw your limb quickly. Pain's not a good signal. It means something's wrong. And so similarly, we have a receptor and an afferent signal. Here it's at the toe where there is a nail sticking out. This is Marv from Home Alone. The afferent signal goes to the dorsal root ganglia and to the spinal cord where it's integrated. So we want to avoid injury. It's integrated in the spinal cord, but what's different about this reflex is that it's not only at one level, it connects to multiple motor outputs in multiple segments of the spinal cord. What would be the purpose of that? Generally, more connections means more efferent signal, a faster, quicker withdrawal, right? More engaging contraction. We're still talking about a circuit on the same side of the body. Again, it's ipsilateral. But this is what we call intersegmental. It's not just at one level in the spinal cord. The interneurons don't just go from sensory to motor and back out. Some interneurons move up or down. They ascend or descend the segments of the spinal cord. Which is good because now we can engage motor neurons to multiple bundles, multiple series or pieces of the flexor muscle. We can really engage that muscle to remove it out of the vicinity of, well, the nail in this case will probably go with you, but if you hit your coffee table, you can get out of the way of the coffee table. So ipsilateral, it's all right leg. Even though it looks like there's a shadow of a left leg here, that's just where it was. And now this is movement backwards. This is all the right leg, all the right side of the spinal cord, ipsilateral, intersegmental reaction. Let's go one step further. You can't have that reaction without compensating for the fact that if you just withdraw your lower leg, you'll fall over. Right? I stub my toe. I don't just pull my leg back. I'd fall over if that were the case. I need to do something to stabilize. So the crossed-extensor reflex is intimately related to the withdrawal reflex. Is a type of reflex that's intimately related. This helps you maintain your balance during the withdrawal portion that we just talked about. And this looks really complicated. There's a lot of arrows and words on this image, but the whole left side is that withdrawal reflex. We've just talked about that. The whole left side we can kind of fade to the background for now. We still see the pain afferent signal synapsing with motor neurons to withdraw the limb, but we're adding context. If we withdraw the limb, what's left to keep our balance? I mean, you could do a somersault if you're really gymnastics inclined and coordinated, but you probably just put your other leg down, right? The contralateral leg. And it's called contralateral because it's the other side of the body. So the same pain sensor synapses with motor neurons on the ipsilateral side and synapses with neurons on the contralateral side to stabilize. Well, how do we stabilize? I'm not going to withdraw the other limb, then I've got no legs to stand on. Stabilizing is extension. Activating the quadriceps, stabilizing the leg vertically, and that's what we see here. At each of those segments in the spinal cord, we have motor neurons now leaving to activate the quadriceps muscles in the contralateral leg. This accomplishes the goal of removing the injured leg from danger, stabilizing the opposite leg so you don't fall over and embarrass yourself. You don't think about this though. Think about all the different reflexes or pathways that need to be involved in this complicated reflex. I want to go back. To one part of last class. Oh, that's interesting. Boo. To one part of last class that was complicated, but I don't think was explained in a way that was really accessible. That's... huh. After this class, and possibly with a little bit more repetition, you're going to be able to name all 16 nerves in the brachial plexus. That's not what I want. I want this. And I promise you it will get easier. So, we talked about the level of the brachial plexus. You can see the roots way up here. As it descends behind the clavicle, there are roots, trunks, divisions, cords, and branches. And it looks messy right now, right? I think first what I want to do is show you the cords in relation to the axillary artery. Let's find it. Axillary artery, right-hand side. So remember we had posterior, lateral, and medial cords. That's probably medial, not that one. There we go. That's probably lateral. Both sides bordering the axillary artery, and way in the back, let's zoom way in. Oh, I'm going to lose it. Way in the back, posterior cord. Even this is a little bit hokey and chopped up. But what I want you to know are the main features. And we can go through and look at, oh, the musculocutaneous nerve. I remember hearing that before. As nice as an AV aid as this is, I've got a much better one for you. Brachial plexus. We're going back to this slide because it's in your textbook, it's familiar. It doesn't give you the nice 3D orientation, but I'm going to help you out. Defining feature to anchor or give yourself context is the branching of the cords. This is an obvious M shape. The M shape connects the lateral and medial cords. MMU from top to bottom tells you the branches or the nerves coming off of that M. Musculocutaneous, median, ulnar. Find the M, MMU, musculocutaneous, median, ulnar. Easy. The only thing left, the posterior cord sits below, beneath it all, with the radial nerve projecting. So our main terminal branches coming off of the cords are like this, MMU with the radial beneath everything. We're going to go through the rest and all the yellow shaded items. I don't expect you to know too well, but you're going to. You're going to know them, whether you want to or not, and that will be clear in a second. Lateral cord, usually pretty well preserved, gives rise to the lateral pectoral nerve, the only one branch. Medial cord's a bit different, but there are 3 individual nerves. The medial antebrachial cutaneous nerve is one, and it's not the same name as what's listed here. Antebrachial is simply a fancy word for forearm. Brachial is simply a fancy word for arm. Medial antebrachial cutaneous nerve is first. Next is the medial brachial cutaneous nerve. Finally, medial pec Medial pectoral nerve arises, and this is really interesting. It actually goes through one of the pectoral muscles to innervate it. But I digress. We'll come back to that. Next, posterior cord. Branches, number 4. Axillary nerve on top, all alone. Okay, it's easy to see the axillary nerve. Down below is a little bit harder. There's lower and upper subscapular. And then between the two, thoracodorsal. Luckily, these are shaded yellow. And with that, we complete the cords. We complete the cords. But we're going to move to the trunks to see a few more. Superior trunk, suprascapular. Oh, sits. And just below it, nerve to subclavius, exits the brachial plexus. If you look towards the ventral rami, so the rootlets, dorsal scapular comes off of C5, and long thoracic C5 to 7. I relish this. This is great. Now you're in brachial plexus heaven, right? All 16 nerves. It's as easy as just listing them off, like I just did. So that's a bit more detail than we did last class. And there are a lot of bewildered faces, and rightly so. I told you were going to hate me for the first little bit.